This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting the show is Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, with a grain market update. He shares the markets are still weather-dependent and volatile. Ed Brokesh, K-State assistant professor in biological and agricultural engineering, continues the show discussing farm safety. It is important to keep farm safety in mind for adults and youth. This week's shows end with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond, as he says there's a chance for a small break from heat and a little bit of moisture. He also reminds people to be careful when shooting off fireworks in these dry conditions. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and on this Friday, as we usually do, we start our show with a grain market update. And in to give us that update, as always, is K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Shelby.
And starting off the conversation, as we usually do, talking about futures.
Yeah, what a serious time for ag producers. We're seeing a whole lot of volatility in grain prices. And on the one hand, they're hoping for the quantities of crops to be produced, which would come with adequate moisture. But on the other, they'd like to sell them for as high a prices as they could. And those prices have been, for the most part, coming from lack of moisture, from drought conditions around the country. So we've sure seen a lot of volatility. Just since you and I talked last, on the 23rd, July corn was trading at 626. And here yesterday, it was trading at 581. D's corn had fallen from 582 down to 528, so about 50, 60 cents lower. But it wasn't just a nice, steady way there. Volatility, jumping up and down, And this is what we find in a weather market. Pretty similar track at wheat. As we're approaching wheat harvest, July wheat was 863 Friday the 23rd of June, and here yesterday on the 29th, wheat traded at 794. So again, 60, 70 cents differential. And for soybeans, July soybeans were at 1487 last Friday on the close, 1483, and that's on yesterday's close. So that's really interesting, I think, to look at with regard to why soybeans have held up just a little bit better on the lead contract. And an issue for folks to watch, too, is that these July contracts are just about to enter into their delivery period, just on the cusp of it. And when that happens, then the attention of the market will shift over to the next contract to be September corn, August soybeans, and September hard red winter wheat. So that in itself will probably make a difference on basis levels for some of these crops. So I think by the time we talk next week, it'd be very interesting to me to see what basis levels for corn, for sorghum, grain sorghum, for soybeans and wheat are relative to what we're seeing right now, and just how quickly the elevators, local buyers roll over to those new contracts. And most of the time in the cash market, people aren't paying a lot of attention to that, but these contract rollovers entering these delivery timeframes can have a lot of impact. And already you can see just from for corn, from July, the 581 close yesterday to 523 for September. As that thing rolls down, it's going to be really interesting to see what the basis does in local basis at all these locations that we watch. So volatility, as we talked about, as the corn market scaling back its expectations based on weather. And again, Chip Redmond in our shop that you speak with talks about the weather realities of all of that better than I can. The point is that we in the last week have jumped to a high of just about 670, traded to a low of about 572 or 3, closed yesterday at 581. So just definitely weather market volatility. For wheat had jumped up to about 885, 890, fallen down as low. And yesterday was as low as it had been, down to 754. So again, up and down, dropping, and we alluded to that some earlier. And for soybeans jumped up as high here recently, 1525, and again fell as low as about 1430, and is trading right in the middle. So I guess as I've said earlier, it's an important time, a lot of volatility. We're weighing our own local production prospects where we want rain, and then we're wondering about all over the country whether that rain's coming and what it'll do to markets. So just quite the time, Shelby.
And Dan, is this uncertainty in the markets creating people to kind of scale back expectations?
I think we're scaling back expectations on the size of these major crops. Instead of 181.5 bushels per acre, early expectations for record high corn yields in the U.S. this year at about a 15.3 billion bushel crop. We're probably closer now to 14.6, 14.7 with about 175. And that's assuming, as the USDA rightfully assumes in these reports, that's assuming normal weather all the way to the end. And if we continue dry, then that 175, 176 is probably optimistic also. And then we're getting down something below 14.5 billion bushels, ending stocks much tighter, and just a lot of questions to be answered in that market as we hit our way into fall harvest. Pretty similar situations for soybean, but again, the heat that's hitting us now coming into July is more important for corn because we're starting into silking and pollination. That process is going to take place, very critical for the corn maturation and productivity. And that process of flowering in soybeans is more of an August situation. So paying attention to corn right now, we're paying attention to all that much more to soybeans as we get on into the month of August. I would say, we're talking about corn and soybeans, sorghum in play too in our part of the world. For wheat harvest moving strongly, starting southeast part of the state. Yesterday, and driving around, wheat harvest is happening in Hays, Kansas. Custom harvesters pulled in early part of yesterday into Colby, Kansas, probably waiting for the crops to get going. So we're really kind of anxiously awaiting what yield reports we get. I have talked with our agronomists, and head scab, big issues, kind of a horse race to get the crop out of the field before the disease really hurts our quality. So quite the time as we're looking at all of this in these markets.
And Dan, you mentioned a USDA report, and the National Agriculture Statistics Survey also put out some recent reports about acreage and grain stocks. And so what did we see there?
Yes, the report coming out at 11 o'clock today, not long after when you and I are done talking, it'll be about 45 minutes, and that report will come out. And it's not really expected to be the major focus of the market. In fact, if it is, it'll be a surprise. We're so focused on yields. But the USDA's early season projection was for 92 million acres of corn to be planted, and the market traders expect just about that number to come in again. If that comes in much higher or lower, particularly if it's lower, then that would be a surprise in the market, probably move us to the higher side. Soybeans anticipated to be just a little bit higher than USDA numbers. We'll be looking at spring wheat numbers, et cetera. I think for us in Kansas, Shelby, that I would not be surprised that we get stronger sorghum acreage being planted than had been thought, just the way that some of the wheat acreage and late planting has come in. So we'll see where that goes. There's a stocks survey also where we estimate how much grain has been used. And there's two things that come out of stocks reports. They tell us how much feed and residual has been used, and they give us some idea of whether we either did a good job or not so good job of estimating previous crops. So that's kind of what I watch for, to get feed use numbers for corn, some for wheat, it better figured out, with more accuracy, and also to get some idea of whether we've got some adjustment looming that have to happen down the road in the crop size from the previous year. And that could happen just because of the difficulty and scale of the task here in the United States.
And Dan, you've mentioned the wheat harvest, and I feel like we've spent quite a bit of time saying, what do we think the wheat harvest is going to be? And as it's getting started, are expectations meeting up with what we thought they were going to be?
Well, I'm hesitant. All I've heard is that we have mixed results. There are some people, and we've seen the results, that have come in that have better than expected yields. Some others that we're not hearing from, probably the ones we're not hearing from much, have been in the areas where those acres have been released or tore up, and they're planted into another crop right now, maybe corn or grain sorghum. So I think the big number is about the 195 to 200 million bushel Kansas wheat crop, almost all of it hard red winter wheat. And will we end up at that or less by the time we get all this done? And I think that, as we mentioned before, we've had some moisture, late moisture in different parts of the state for wheat that was still there to have gained from it. And I know that folks are anxiously hoping with the high prices that we have, that we have some bushels to sell. And best of fortune, I hope for the sake of all of our Kansas farmers that they do get some bushels out of this if they possibly can, and that prices hold up quite a bit. And again, as we talked about, you've got these major issues happening worldwide in the world wheat market. We still struggle for wheat exports in the U.S. For a variety of reasons. So any strength that we have, it's kind of this carryover from these big issues in the world and the threat to people holding wheat to the market in the U.S. that, gosh, we might see a unexpected surge sometime in U.S. wheat exports, and that would be a game changer, I think, in terms of cash prices in Kansas and around the country. And
as we round out today's conversation, what key points would you like producers to take home with them concerning the grain market?
Just a time of great volatility, and we can talk a lot about forward pricing. It's difficult to forward price right now with especially for corn and soybeans. I mean, forward pricing for wheat is almost a foregone deal because we're not forward pricing. We have the chance to price the cash, and for what's harvested. But people under irrigation who have moisture so far, they feel pretty confident. We've seen prices go up and down. I don't know that this early in the summer we can say that our volatility is done. But the markets are sure hyper reactive, and if it seems like we've gone down in these markets on some rains that have come, but yet you stand back and you see the drought monitors in these areas, and they're not solved. There's still room for a lot of volatility and uncertainty in these markets in the next 60 to 90 days.
Looks like we'll just kind of have to wait and see what's going to happen. Dan, I appreciate you coming on today and giving us a grain market update.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. The links to some of his information you can find in today's show notes or go to AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and something we wanted to talk about is farm safety, especially as children have been out of school now, and just to reiterate some thoughts for them, but also for adults and other people coming out to the farming operations. And then to share some of his knowledge, we have Assistant Professor in Biological and Agricultural Engineering here at Kansas State University, Ed Brokesh. Ed, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Talking about children on farms, specifically first focusing around livestock.
Yes, children and livestock are not necessarily a good mix because they don't necessarily understand the magnitude of the animals and what they can do to the children, as well as what the children can do to the animals. We all know that kids want to help out, but sometimes they can do a pretty good imitation of an ape and scare the living daylights out of a herd of cattle, and the next thing you know, you're spending the evening chasing cattle or something like that. And so you want to be proactive with children and cattle or any livestock, and be frank with them and say, hey, children, let's be calm when we're around these animals. They are scared of you as you are them. Respect these animals because they are much bigger than you and can hurt you.
And I know something that my mother did was if we were working our livestock, someone else always had to be out there. So even if the animal might be really calm, thinking of making sure you know where that kid is or what that kid's kind of doing outside.
Very much so. Don't leave them to their own devices because who knows what they will get themselves into. And certainly when you're working livestock, working cattle, that's a high-stress time. We see all the memes on the social media of couples and their large arguments or whatever you want to call it that may occur. And, if the kids are doing something, they may get themselves into trouble, and now you've got a child with a problem and you've got livestock that needs help. You do not want to leave the kids to their own devices and end up adding stress to an already stressful situation.
And talking about, maybe sometimes being tired. When it comes to harvest time, which is something we're in right now, being around big machinery, just like, a lot of our cars now have backup cameras. Tractors don't. And so making sure that your children are not around big machinery.
Yes, around big machinery. My fond memories of being in harvest was nap time and sleeping on the truck or sleeping underneath the truck, that's not necessarily a bright and wise thing to do. And so being aware that kids are in the field, if you have them there, maybe they shouldn't be in the field. Let's face it, agriculture is an industry, and if we were talking about an industry of automotive or mining or something like that, kids would not be there. We maybe need to start thinking in terms of the same thing with agriculture. Yeah, it's one of the fondest things we all remember about growing up is being in the tractor with Dad or in a grain truck with Mom, and that's how we learned. But let's face it, agriculture is much different today than it was years ago, and maybe it's time to rethink these and treat agriculture as the industry that it really is and keep the kids out.
And thinking on maybe a little bit smaller scale of machinery, there's a reason you have to be a certain weight to run a lawnmower.
Lawnmowers, first off, one of the safety features on a lawnmower is the sensor in the seat that tells the machine that there's somebody there and somebody's in control. And if you are subverting that, now that machine can take off on its own and do serious damage to fences, gates, vehicles, and Mom's flowers. But also, if the kid happens to fall off and you've got some sort of device on there to keep it going to make up for the weight, now you've put your child at severe risk there. So there is a weight limit there, and it has to do with the safety switches. And so we want to have that safety switch not defeated by a weight. The other thing, let's face it, kids are capable of doing stuff with the electronics and such, but a machine is a machine, and there's a lot of power, there's a lot of sharp edges, and they can do harm to themselves and other things very easily.
Going away from the big machinery or even the smaller machinery, chemicals. So making sure it's up high enough, but then also maybe labeled.
Every container should be labeled. If you've got a container with a chemical in it that you do not know what's in it, that's a hazard. You have to treat it as a hazardous material, even if it might be water. You just don't know what is in there. And so the practice should be, if you are putting chemical from one container to another, you stop and label it. Sharpie pens are cheap. You should have plenty of those and use those and make sure you label everything. Certainly keep your chemicals up and out of the way and away from where kids can get at them. From an economic point of view, these chemicals are not cheap. So why are you risking the cost of the chemical being wasted? I had, as a kid, I could do a lot of things with Dad's stuff. So, here's a chemical that's very expensive, and you've got it down where a kid can go do something with it. One, that's a hazard to your pocketbook, but two, you're really risking the child. And we all know how these chemicals are capable of doing a lot of good, but in highly concentrated forms, they can be very toxic to children, and they're very toxic to you and I. And we, when we're handling these things, we need to be focused on having the right personal protective equipment, proper chemical gloves. As we all know that our hands are one of the most absorbent areas on the body. We need to have eye protection because we don't want the chemical splashed in our eye and ingested that way, and certainly protect our nose and our mouth to make sure that we're not ingesting any chemicals that way either.
Ed, I think you made a good point that farm safety is important for children, but also for adults. And when we're thinking about adults working maybe a little bit more hands-on on the machinery, what are a few things that you'd like them to remember?
One, not get in a hurry. That's what gets you mostly into trouble. I've made as many mistakes as anybody else, and usually it results into me being in a hurry. We are oftentimes being in a hurry. The first thing you're going to do is damage the machine you're working with. But then also being in a hurry, you run the risk of damaging yourself. Either you'll knock something over and it'll fall on you, and at the minimum, you're sore for a few days. The very worst, you are in the hospital or worse. And anything we can do to prevent an injury, we should. And first off is make sure you got the right equipment, protective equipment, leather gloves as appropriate, safety glasses as appropriate. respirators, dust masks. That's something that a lot of people forget about is wearing those things. For myself, I have allergies, and if I don't wear a dust mask, then I can't sleep at night. And so there's that short-term aspect of why you should wear a dust mask or a respirator in certain situations. But the bigger thing is over time and over your life, multiple exposures to dust and other things can build up, and so that, when you're 50 or 60 years old, now you've got a severe problem that could have been prevented. Same goes for your ears, hearing protection. I know we all kind of want to be lax about that. Why should we wear hearing protection? But and I'm as guilty of it as anybody. And one of my favorite sayings right now is "huh," and that's because I just don't hear as well. And that's a preventable thing. Years and years of abusing my hearing has caused that, and we don't need to do that. Hearing protection is so readily available and so cheap. That's the other thing to look around. To go to your local hardware store, the safety glasses, the hearing protection, the gloves. It's relatively cheap, and the benefit you can get from it for your life matters. The other thing while we're talking about hearing protection and such is just, dressing for the job you're doing. And then let's face it now, too, sun's bright. Go buy that can of sunscreen, and while you're at it, get the bug spray too, because there's plenty of ticks, there's plenty of mosquitoes out there, and they carry some nasty diseases. And let's face it, we're out there in the environment, we're around these things. I keep an annual score of how many ticks I pulled off of myself, and that's not really a good thing that we should be doing. We shouldn't be proud of how many ticks we've pulled off of ourselves. So take some time, get the bug spray out, apply that, take the time, put some sunscreen on. Let's protect our skin so we don't have skin cancers and such like that when we're older.
A point you wanted to point out, Ed, that you mentioned to me was the signs for slow-moving vehicles on tractors.
Yeah, that's another pet peeve of mine is the SMV sign. As I drive through the country, I'm collecting images of slow-moving signs, SMVs, on things that they shouldn't be on, like gates, driveways, the posts, and I've even seen them on the back of a van going from the hotel to an airport. That's not what an SMV's for. It should be for something that's traveling 25 miles per hour or less. And if your newer tractors will travel faster than that, if you've got it on an SMV on a tractor that's traveling faster, there's a little SIS sign that tells you how fast the vehicle can go that should be on there as well. But the SMV sign needs to be on moving vehicles, not on a post.
That was K-State Assistant Professor in Biological and Agricultural Engineering, Ed Brokesh. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we finish our Friday show, as we usually do, with a weather update, and we're joined with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So getting started with what we've recently seen, and we've recently seen some heat.
Yeah, it's been warm this week. We had several days of 100-degree heat. The highest I saw was right around 106 down in South Central, and most of that heat's been focused in the central and the eastern part of the state. That heat dome basically from Texas expanded northward and brought that ridge of high pressure further north than what we've seen the last few weeks. And so it's been really warm, and at night we've not seen a whole lot of recovery either. We've seen overnight lows in the mid to upper 70s and even some 80s in places. And that's a real challenge when we think about cattle comfort and human comfort too if they're outside. It takes more for the body to recover from that kind of heat.
And I know on Thursday morning we had some storms up in the northern part of Kansas, and so are we expecting to see some more of that?
Yeah, so as that ridge of high pressure built northward, it shifted the axis of storms to our north, to an area that really needed it, honestly. And we'll see another round of storms as that ridge kind of breaks down Friday night into Saturday morning. and a little bit more widespread precipitation. And so we're going to see scattered storms throughout the next week, really, and it's going to be isolated, that classic convective nature of summertime thunderstorms. And the folks that get moisture will get a lot. There'll be a lot more that don't get rain. And so no widespread rainfall is expected at this point. We do still have that concern of severe weather. We still have mostly strong winds are our biggest concern, and then hail, tornadoes are definitely diminishing of a threat. And so when we get these big complexes that develop, they tend to get a lot of straight line wind.
And thinking of moisture, have we seen any improvement in the drought monitor?
Yeah, so this week, drought monitor kind of continued that trend of just shifting the axis of drought further east into parts of central and eastern Kansas. We saw pretty widespread D1 and D2 expansion, especially in the northeast part of the state, with not nearly as much improvement, subtle improvements in the southwest. So we're starting to see that trend of less improvement, more degradation, and reflect the drier conditions we've seen over the last several weeks.
And looking forward, are we going to have a little bit of relief from the heat?
Yeah, so as that high pressure shifts off to the east and south again, it kind of gets pushed back south. We still have a really prominent jet stream pattern due to our El Nino influences, which we just don't typically see in the summertime. And so that's going to remain an active storm pattern for this region and push a hotter air to our south and east and give us a break, at least for the next week or two. I think as you get further into July, we're going to open up that door and we're probably going to be much warmer again.
So crossing our fingers for maybe a little bit of precipitation.
We definitely need it in a lot of places. And so hopefully we can at least get half those summer rain and maybe more if we can get some more widespread rain events.
As the drought has continued to expand, what is the water supply looking like for Kansas?
Yeah, so we've seen some really decreased stream flows, especially in portions of central and eastern Kansas with a lack of early summer precipitation. And that's one of the key times of the year where the lakes and reservoirs can recharge. And with these low stream flows, we're starting to get concerned about Tuttle, for instance, here in Manhattan, is at its normal level, but there's no inflow coming in. And so if we don't get this widespread moisture and increased runoff, we're going to likely see below average levels. And further to the south, there's increasing concern because they needed a lot more moisture and they haven't gotten it. And so it's starting to become a growing concern. And it's at least something we need to be aware of and be thoughtful of, is that our not overall water supply, but our lakes and reservoirs are definitely below average, and streams and rivers are much below average.
Speaking of rain, drought, it's also almost the 4th of July. And so an important thing to mention, fireworks and being safe with fireworks in the dry conditions.
Yeah, we've had enough dry conditions with the grass, even where it's green, is dried out. And we think about, we got wheat in the field. We've even seen some active fire in like cedar as well. So their landscapes carrying fire more than we would typically see this time of year. July means a lot of people are blowing off fireworks. You typically see a secondary peak in wildfires early July. So we need to be really smart and cognizant that with these persistent drought conditions, we can get a lot of fire activity, and the ground is very, very receptive to fuel. So let's not blow off fireworks in grass, and let's avoid any problems.
Chip, thank you for coming in and giving us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you for this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you on Monday.